Hello, Rundown fans, and anyone else who happens to be watching this video. If you are new to the Rundown, click like, subscribe. There's four of us that get together normally. It tends to be Friday nights. Sometimes it's Saturday mornings, depending on our schedules, and talk about issues and events. And sometimes we do interviews. And so I was very fortunate to have one Hugh Owen of the Colby Center for Creation drop by and talk to us for a little bit. So that video is about to follow. Just a couple of things, some logistical things. I am not experienced in video editing or production, and so I don't have all the fancy equipment to do fun things, multiple angles and all this stuff. I was gonna try to do it, but it just, it ended up not working out. So we just did a straight up interview here in the office, and which created its technical problems that to get through. So I, did my very best to minimize distractions from myself, and so I think I did a fairly good job cutting that and getting that right. But if you don't know Hugh Owen from the Colby Center for Creation, wonderful man, by the way. If you've ever had the privilege of meeting him, and you're just filled with the faith and devotion and love for our Lord and our Blessed Mother. So he was here to do a debate on creationism at the Chesterton Academy in Spokane. And just before that, stopped by so I could ask him some questions. So here is that interview. And again, don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you haven't already done it for new updates when we do live streams or more interviews like this in the future. So thank you very much. Links below in the description for the Colby Center and for other things we talked about. God bless. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am joined live by Hugh Owen from the Colby Center, and we're here to talk about issues about creation, about scripture, wherever else. This is usually when I do an interview, it's scripted. I get the questions, I send it ahead of time, so everyone knows exactly what's going to be asked. This is kind of impromptu and a bit of a conversation. And I apologize, I don't have all the professional recording equipment to make this look really cool, but we're going to make it work. So Hugh, thank you for joining us.
It's my joy to be here.
So I just have a couple of questions. So what brings you out to this area, to North Idaho today?
Well, we have an invitation to a debate at the Chesterton Academy in Spokane this evening. And so since it's very rare that we have the opportunity to have a debate, we never refuse an invitation, and that's what has brought me into this beautiful part of the country.
So what I should say, why don't you get chances to debate often? Because you offer to debate quite a bit, but nobody seems to want to.
Yes, well, only God knows the answer to that question, but it is interesting that while so many highly educated Catholics seem to think that the traditional reading of Genesis is obsolete, you would think that there would be many, many people who would like to have the opportunity to set us straight, or at least to set straight the people who have been persuaded by the arguments that we're making. But for whatever reason, that isn't usually the case. So in the last 23 years, we have only had a very few opportunities to debate. And so we're very grateful whenever one comes along.
Trent Horn is on the internet a lot and always, talking about the absurdity of being a creationist. That's just Protestant fundamentalism. So two questions. One, Trent likes to debate people. Have you ever offered to debate him? Has he ever accepted, or did that ever decline? And the second thing is kind of the matter of his argument as well. Creation, all this creationist stuff comes from Protestants. It's not really Catholic. And you point out, well, wait a minute, that we go back to the fathers. Well, yeah, but that things developed. It's like, wait, so at a certain time it was, and then they'll vociferously deny that creationism was ever a Catholic doctrine.
Yes. Well, those are very good questions. And to take the first one, I don't really want to go into the details, but I do have it because the devil has a way of trying to sabotage these debates before they even happen, and I don't want to run the risk of playing into his hands. But I do have a friend who's been in touch with Trent Horn's organization, and God willing, we may have an opportunity to have a debate in 2024. And if that comes to pass, we'll be delighted. Now, as far as the second question is concerned, this is a very, very important topic because we have found from day one, and the Kobe Center is just over 23 years old. We were incorporated by the bureaucrats in Richmond, Virginia, on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, our principal patroness, in the Jubilee year 2000. And of course, they had no idea what they were doing, but she made sure that we were actually incorporated on her day. And from the very beginning, we have been confronted with this accusation again and again that what we're defending is just Protestant fundamentalism, and that Catholics never took the first chapters of Genesis literally. But of course, anybody that goes back and studies what the apostles, fathers, and doctors of the church believed and taught knows that every single father and doctor of the church believed and taught that Genesis is a sacred history, not an allegory, not a poem, not a myth, and that it gives a literal historical account of how God created the world and what happened in the first period of human history. And one of our members has done an amazing job of collecting catechisms and theological manuals that were in use right up to the 20th century, and has documented the fact that every Catholic in the entire world, until very recently, was taught that God created everything in 6 days, less than 10,000 years ago. So this whole idea that this is something that Protestant fundamentalists came up with is really completely wrong.
Indeed, it's one of those arguments that surprises me. It's like, I mean, Protestants, generally speaking, especially Lutherans and Presbyterians and whatnot, that Christ is King and that Christ is God, is God and man.
Yes.
And would adhere to the Council of Chalcedon. Is that Protestant now because they adhere? It almost seems like that's what we're looking at.
Yes,
at a certain level.
It's true, and we have to remember anything that the Protestants have that is true, they got from the Catholics. So we shouldn't be surprised that this is just one more doctrine to add to the list of things that they have, that not all of them, of course, but some of them have it right because they got it from the Catholic Church. We need to realize that the Roman Catechism, the Catechism of Trent, is the most authoritative catechism in the history of the Catholic Church, the gold standard for teaching and preaching the dogmas of the faith for 350 years in the entire world, still authoritative. And if you go to the first article of the Creed and you read how St. Charles Borromeo and his team defined the dogma of creation, that's essentially what all Christians believed, including the separated brethren who at least identify as Christians. And if you read the definition of the dogma of creation, it's very clear. God created, the divinity created all things in the beginning. He spoke and they were made. He commanded and they were created. And the Roman Catechism goes on to explain this is how God created all the different kinds of plants. This is how he created all the heavenly bodies. This is how he created the creatures of the air and the sea and the land. And this is how he created Adam, body and soul, and Eve from Adam's side. So this is how the dogma of creation was understood in the entire Christian world from the time of the apostles. And the fact that this catechism was the gold standard for teaching and preaching until very recently, and still is authoritative, is a very clear refutation of this argument that this interpretation of Genesis is some kind of Protestant innovation. Now, one thing that I think is good to mention is that there are Catholic scholars who do acknowledge that at least most of the fathers did believe that Genesis was gives us a literal historical account of how God created the world and what happened in the first period of human history. But most of them will say, but there was that great exception, St. Augustine. He did not take Genesis as history. He had a purely allegorical interpretation of the first chapters of Genesis.
Because he's the youngest of all young earth creationists, he thinks the whole entire world was created instantaneously.
Exactly. And that's the funny thing about it, is that so many champions of theistic evolution, the idea that God used an evolutionary process over billions of years until he evolved a subhuman primate or primates to the point where they could receive a human soul, and then infused human souls into two or more of these evolved subhuman primates. So many of these theistic evolutionists, Catholic theistic evolutionists, will point to St. Augustine as their patristic basis for this theistic evolutionism. But as Ryan just pointed out, in reality, St. Augustine held to an instantaneous creation of all things that was revealed to the angels in installments that correspond to the 6 days of creation. But he would have shed his last drop of blood, like all the other fathers and doctors of the church, for the literal historical truth of every word in the sacred history of Genesis. And he flat out says in the literal interpretation of Genesis that Genesis is not written in the style of allegory, like the Song of Songs, but from beginning to end in the style of history as the books of Kings. The only point on which he differs from the overwhelming majority of the fathers who held that the days of Genesis 1 were literal 24-hour days is on the meaning of day, yom or dies in Genesis 1. And this is because he did not have a perfect translation of the Hebrew text of Genesis. And we have an article on our website which goes into detail about this and demonstrates that in his Vetus Latina, in the Old Latin translation of Genesis, it appears that there would be a contradiction between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 if you take the days of Genesis 1 as sequential 24-hour days. But that is the only point in all of Genesis 1 to 11 where St. Augustine deviated from the overwhelming majority view. And if you use St. Jerome's Vulgate translation, which is faithfully translated into English in the Douay-Rheims, there's no longer any contradiction at all. So it's virtually certain that if St. Augustine had been working with the Vulgate when he made his exegesis, he would never have resorted to this instantaneous creation interpretation, which he also fell into because he did not work from the original Greek text of the deuterocanonical books. So in Sirach 18:1, the Latin says God created all things simul, and simul has a semantic range and can mean all together, or it could mean at the same time, or more or less relatively at the same time. But he took it to mean at the same instant. And this is again very revealing because in the actual Greek, it says that God created all things koine, which just means in common, without exception. That's why the Koine Greek, this was the common Greek that was spoken throughout the Roman Empire. But again, he was hampered by the fact that he was working with translations and not working with the original languages. And so he was trying to be faithful to the scripture without allowing that there could be any contradiction, because he knew there are no errors in the Bible, so everything has to be 100% true. And this led him into the idea that it was an instantaneous creation, which would certainly be in keeping with the character of God, and that he then revealed it to the angels in 6 installments. But something that other fathers and doctors throughout the history of the church have pointed out, and that is very much highlighted in the Catechism of Trent, is the reason why God created everything in 6 days. And I think it's worth taking a few moments to talk about that, because if you get out your Roman Catechism or go online and look it up, go to the first article of the Creed and read how the dogma of creation is explained, you find that after explaining that God created everything in 6 days, and that he then was finished creating all things because he created everything for us, and we would say in view of the Immaculate Conception and the Incarnation, St. Charles Borromeo and his team then make sure that every pastor in the world teaches his people that God consecrated the 7th day at the beginning of the world, and they refer the pastors, because the Catechism of Trent is written for pastors. It's not written for most Catholics because they're illiterate and can't even read. But they direct the pastors to Exodus, because it's in Exodus that Moses tells us that God, with the finger of God himself, writes the 10 commandments on tablets of stone. And it's fascinating that in the 10 commandments, there is only one where God commands us to remember something. And this is quite important because, for example, we don't need to be told to remember to honor our mother and father. It's obvious we receive life from our parents and we should honor them. It just flows from the natural law. But what's the one commandment that we are not going to be able to know just from nature, just from looking at the universe as it is? It's the 3rd commandment. And so it begins, remember to keep holy the Sabbath day. And God says, you're to work for 6 days and consecrate the 7th day to me. Why? Because God created the heavens and the earth and the seas and all they contain in 6 days, and consecrated the 7th day at the foundation of the world. And this is so important, because what it's telling us is that, of course, God could have created everything in 57 trillion years, in 2 seconds, in any period of time that he chose. He's God. But what we're being taught is that God created the world in 6 days and consecrated the 7th day because he's a loving father. And he actually created the world according to this rhythm that we must follow if we want to live a happy, healthy, holy life. And isn't this what every good father does? The good father doesn't say to his children, go to confession frequently. First, he goes to confession frequently. And then when he tells his children, you must go to confession frequently, they see that this is what their father does. And that's what gives weight to his words. Well, God did exactly this by the way that he created the world. He loves us so much that he actually created the world according to the rhythm that we must live by if we want to live a happy, healthy, holy life. And until very recently, all Catholics were brought up to understand this. And this made every Catholic realize, I am the apple of God's eye. He made everything in this entire universe for me. He even created the world according to the rhythm that I must live by if I want to live a happy, healthy, holy life. Now, Catholics are being taught what I was taught as a secular humanist growing up, that the earth is a speck of dust in a remote corner of a vast universe, and humans didn't even evolve until after 13.7 billion years. And I can tell you, that in and of itself is enough to make a young person want to get tattooed, pierced, use alcohol, use drugs, and jump off a skyscraper.
Nec spe, nec metu.
Yes.
Neither hope nor fear.
Exactly. And yet we are literally paying people good money to teach this to our own children and grandchildren in Catholic schools and universities all over the world. It's literally suicidal.
So, as we mentioned Augustine earlier, whenever anyone engages in these issues, one of the first things that happens is somebody comes on social media or wherever and says, but didn't Augustine say that it's always a shame when a Christian comes and tries to engage in the pagan sciences with no concept of what they are, and then makes a fool of himself, and then makes the whole faith then look foolish because of that? And you're not a scientist, I'm not a scientist, so what do we indeed, I'm not a practical scientist. I'm the closest I would approach it would be philosophy of science, and so otherwise I wouldn't have a leg to stand on any kind of practical chemistry,
right?
Even the evolutionary biology or whatever, for the apart from some of the terminology, I'm not a practitioner in any of these things. So what do I know about it? What do I know about chemistry? And you wouldn't want me making a mole equation to get your IVs set. You'd be killing a bunch of people. So it's like, so how is it that we can talk on these matters that involve so much science without falling victim to Augustine's dictum, which again, like I said, someone's going to put it up every time you start talking about these issues, definitely. Whether it's on Fedbook or on Twitter. I refuse to call it X.
Yes.
Sorry, Elon. Or GooTube. Someone will put it in the comments on YouTube. Somebody will put it,
right.
Wherever. So, how do we not fall afoul of that particular dictum?
I am so glad that you brought that up. And I refer you again to the article on St. Augustine on the Kolbe website. I think it's called Rediscovering the Literal Interpretation of St. Augustine or something like that. But if you just put Augustine...
We'll link it in the notes here.
Great. So if you read the whole article, you'll get a lot more detail than I would be able to give in this short interview. But it's so ironic that people bring up that particular passage, because it actually is a passage that is supportive of the position that we're defending, and I'll explain why. You see, St. Augustine and every father and doctor of the church, including St. Thomas Aquinas, of course, believed and taught that the entire work of creation was supernatural, and that when God finished creating everything for us in our first parents, St. Adam and St. Eve, he stopped creating new kinds of creatures, and only then did the natural order begin, what some doctors like St. Bonaventure call the order of providence. That's what we're living in. Now, if you think about that, you can see that this establishes the boundaries of natural science. Because if the entire work of creation was supernatural, then it doesn't matter how smart you are, it doesn't matter how good your technology is, you can't study the universe as it is now and extrapolate from that all the way back to the beginning to explain how everything came to be. And if you try, you're going to come up with the wrong answer every single time. It would be like somebody taking some of the wine at Cana a few minutes after our Lord changed the water into wine and subjecting it to all kinds of chemical analysis so that you could conclude how old the wine was and how it came to be. Obviously, you could be the smartest scientist who ever lived with the best lab facilities and you're never going to come up with the right answer. So the first thing that readers need to understand is that St. Augustine is not talking about creation. In fact, he's talking about natural science within its proper boundaries. So, for example, he's talking about things like, let's say,
Aristotle's causes.
Yes, exactly. And so his dictum would apply to a conversation about what kinds of changes can take place within the natural order. And there he would say, yes, you've got to be careful as a Catholic that you don't rush in and voice opinions that you claim are based in the scriptures and in the tradition of the church, which contradict what experts in some area of natural science have determined about something within the natural order. That is totally different from what we're talking about here. We are talking about something that is beyond the proper boundaries of the natural sciences. And St. Thomas is very clear about this in the Summa. He says, in the works of nature, which is the realm of natural science, creation does not enter, but is presupposed to the works of nature. So even a layperson who has no specialized training in astronomy, in geology, and biology, not only has the right, but the duty to defend and proclaim what God revealed about how he created the world in the beginning. And St. Augustine actually says in another place that it's a great shame that Catholics are intimidated by pagan philosophers who give naturalistic accounts of things that God reveals in the Bible to be supernatural, because they're intimidated by the learning of these philosophers. That's the passage that ought to be applied to this discussion. And St. Augustine says, then these Catholics abandon the fruitful field of the Word of God for this, very much kind of devastated, fruitless field of inquiry that the pagan philosophers spend all of their time in. So in short, the criticism that people are constantly throwing at us from St. Augustine does not apply to what God revealed about how he created the world. It applies to natural science that stays within the proper boundaries, and that can only be with regard to things as they are since the entire work of creation was finished.
In other words, it's a question of metaphysics and ontology, not a question of physics and anthropology and biology and so on.
Exactly.
And so forth.
Yes.
So then I guess the next question would be, so God creates the world, we observe the world. So isn't it fair that if the natural sciences come to, are coming to the conclusion that, well, the things, we're seeing evidence that this is what took place, that would, again, kind of point to what that creation event was, so that, because this is where people are going to come from, because people are, of course, blinded and think that all the evolutionary sciences, that's absolutely untouchable, absolutely right. You're an idiot if you deny it.
Yes.
You're basically saying 2 + 2 is 5 if you deny all our evolutionary science. And I know you've got a lot of articles on your website about the weaknesses written by scientists, practitioners of science, not people like us,
Right.
would be more on the philosophy side. So I do encourage you to check those out. But beside that, so wouldn't the observations we make in science have an impact on the creation event?
Yes. One of the most important scriptures relevant to this discussion is the second epistle of St. Peter, chapter 3, which we believe is one of the most amazing prophetic passages in the entire Bible. Because here we have St. Peter, our first pope, almost 2,000 years ago, predicting the evolution revolution against the fundamental doctrine of creation. And in this passage, St. Peter says that in the last days, so far in the future, scoffers are going to come into the church saying, things have always been the same from the beginning of creation. That is, from the beginning of the universe. Now, this is absolutely amazing because, remember, St. Peter was not a philosopher. He ran a fishing business. And yet, almost 2,000 years ago, he sums up the premise that undergirds every form of evolutionary thought, the theistic as well as the atheistic. Because if you go back and study the history, you find that it was René Descartes and the so-called Enlightenment philosophers who were the first people in the history of Christianity to be taken seriously when they began to propose that it was more reasonable to explain the origins of things in nature, like the solar system or plants, animals, even the human body, in terms of the same material processes that are going on now. Until then, there was not a single major thinker in Christendom who did not strictly adhere to that creation providence distinction that we just talked about. And so until the so-called Enlightenment, every theologian worth his salt knew that that is absurd to hold that things have always been the same from the beginning of the universe. And of course, Descartes' works were put on the index of forbidden books because any Orthodox Catholic theologian knew that what he was proposing wasn't reasonable at all, and that it was completely unreasonable to take what God told you was completely supernatural and to say, oh no, it's going to be more reasonable if we explain this in terms of natural processes. So that's the first thing that we need to understand. But he goes on to say that these scoffers are also going to deny the fact, not the pious belief, that there was also a divine judgment on the entire earth with Noah's flood. So that he says the world that then was before the flood perished with the flood, which means we can't even look at the earth as it is today and know what it was like before Noah's flood, much less what it was like when God was bringing everything into existence from nothing in the beginning. So isn't it amazing that St. Peter predicted exactly what happened beginning in the so-called Enlightenment period? Because first you have the Enlightenment philosophers, Descartes, Spinoza, Immanuel Kant, and the rest of them, proposing that it's much more reasonable to explain how everything came to be in terms of the same material processes that are going on now. The present is the key to the past. Then the second wave of the revolution is the geologists, Charles Lyell, James Hutton, Buffon. They take this totally false principle of uniformitarianism, that the present is the key to the past, and they apply that to reinterpret the rocks all over the earth in terms of this uniformitarian idea that there never was a global flood. That's just a fairy tale. We can explain everything we see in terms of the same localized gradual processes that we see going on now. And so they end up coming up with the time scale because they deny the reality of the global flood. So these massive geological formations, which can only be logically explained in terms of the flood, they now explain in terms of the same kinds of processes that we observe today operating over these immense periods of time. And that brings us directly to your question, because in making observations of the earth as it is now, if we actually accept what God revealed and what all the fathers, doctors, popes, and council fathers believed and taught from the beginning, that it was a totally supernatural creation, and then that there was a global flood that completely transformed the face of the earth, what we actually observe is much more consistent with that than it is with this idea that everything evolved over hundreds of millions of years through the same material processes that are going on now. But we have to be careful, because some, I think, especially of our separated brethren, in their zeal to defend the literal historical truth of the sacred history of Genesis, fall into the trap of saying that we can prove that creation and the global flood are true just from looking at the empirical evidence. And I think that is a mistake, because in both of these instances, whether we're talking about the creation of all things in the beginning or the supernatural judgment of the flood, we're talking about something that is supernatural. And that's why we always say to people, we can look at the earth and see that everything that we observe is very consistent with the historical reality of a global flood about 4,500 years ago. But we say we will never be able to give a completely naturalistic account of the flood, because it was a supernatural judgment. So it's perfectly legitimate to propose different mechanisms that could have been at work when the flood took place. But we are convinced that nobody is ever going to come up with a purely naturalistic explanation for how the flood took place, because it was a supernatural divine judgment.
What about what involves natural things? So, for example, Noah has to take two of every kind.
Yes.
And so you look at every genus of creature and whatnot. So in 4,500 and so on, years, some odd years, you now have where you've there's such a diversity of so many types, just insect life alone. And then and species that seem to cross between the two. Like, what is that one that looks like a cross between a spider and a scorpion? I forget. You've got, and then animals. When you get to animals, birds, and all their kinds and things that, they're entirely different. A platypus. All these things do, is it even technically possible that they could have developed from the time of Noah gets off the ark with all the animals and all the bugs and all, let alone the logistics of, housing them, which for the modern mind, thinking of, we don't know what kind of science they had pre-Diluvian world, and
Yes.
whether there was something going on with the ark that is not revealed in the sacred literature they might have had. And that's just speculation. Assume that it's caveman level, Noah and his sons taking all these logs and building up their ark and gathering all the animals that were about, and all the insects, every single one, down to all different kinds, and getting off the ark and letting them all go.
Yes.
And they produce the diversity of spiders, the diversity of bugs, mosquitoes, flies, butterflies, etc. How do we even begin to try to account for that naturally? Because most zoologists, most anthropologists, or not anthropologists, wrong, biologists are going to say, well, it's absolutely impossible for that to have come about in 4,000 years.
Yes. Well, it's a fascinating subject, but the flood account in Genesis is perfectly harmonious with everything that we observe in the biosphere. So let's just take a couple of points. First of all, everything that we see in nature tells us that St. Thomas was absolutely correct when he spoke about the first perfection of the universe, which he defines in the Summa as the completeness of the world at its first founding. And for him, and for all the fathers and doctors of the church, that means every kind of creature existed, perfect, each one perfect according to its nature, all together with man and for man from the beginning of the universe. And this applies to every kind of creature. But let's remember, the kind is very different from the biological species. For example, God created some wolf kind of creature from which all the wolves, possibly all the hyenas and coyotes, and certainly every breed of dog from a Chihuahua to a Great Dane is descended. That's all one kind. But that's not evolution, that's devolution, because God, in his genius, wrote into the genome of that original wolf kind of creature all the genetic potential for all that variety that we see today. So when Noah was told to take every kind of land-dwelling animal on the ark, this did not mean that he took every what we would call species, or even necessarily what biologists today call genera. It's very possible that the kind was more at the level of what we would call family in biological taxonomy today. So the number of different kinds of animals was much smaller than what the skeptics say today. They say, oh, he could never have taken all the different kinds of animals, because they're not thinking in terms of the biblical kind. They're trying to say that he would have had to have every species that's identified by biologists today among the land-dwelling animals, and that's absurd. What the Bible is talking about is all the different kinds of land-dwelling animals. Now, the other thing that is relevant to this discussion is that when I was an undergraduate at Princeton University, the consensus view in biology in the entire world was that 98% of our DNA was junk, because at that time, biologists thought that the only DNA that was significant was the DNA that codes for protein, that tells little molecular machines in our cells how to put amino acids together to form proteins, which make up the building blocks of our bodies. And so they literally thought and taught that the 98% of our DNA that doesn't code for protein was non-functional, left over from the hundreds of millions of years of evolution. Now, this shows that, contrary to what Bill Nye, the science guy, and so many other people say,
not a biologist,
evolution is actually the worst catastrophe that ever happened to scientific and medical research, because that's what's actually anti-science. The belief in molecules to man evolution undoubtedly retarded progress in the field of genetics by at least 15 or 20 years. Finally, there was a minority within the scientific community who thought, well, it's a little bit much to think that 98% of all the DNA is junk. And so finally, funding was obtained for Project ENCODE to actually study the non-coding, the so-called junk DNA. And of course, what did they find? They found that the junk DNA isn't junk after all, that it actually operates at a higher level of functioning than the DNA that codes for protein. It actually frequently switches on and off very sophisticated genetic programs. And this explains why, when the different kinds of animals came off the ark and they moved into different kinds of environments, there could be very rapid adaptation, because God, in his genius, had written into the genomes of all these different kinds of creatures, including humans, the ability to adapt very rapidly two different environments. And nobody understands exactly how this works yet. It's a very, very active field of research. But we know, for example, that there's a kind of lizard called the crested anole. And I think it's in Puerto Rico that this lizard has very rapidly adapted to urbanization. And in a relatively short period of time, just a few generations, these lizards change their feet and their scales to adapt to this urban environment. But when biologists have studied them in detail, they find that there are a lot of genes that have been activated in these urbanized crested anole. Well, that's not evolution. All that programming was already written into the ancestors of these creatures by God. But there was something about these environmental changes that triggered and activated through the quote unquote junk DNA the ability to bring into play these different genetic programs that had been latent in the creature before. And isn't it fascinating that in the sacred history of Genesis, after the original sin, what does God say to Adam? He says, "Cursed is the ground because of you. Thorns and thistles it will bring forth to you." And do you know it's been written up in peer-reviewed scientific journals that, for example, there's a type of radish which in its original condition does not have any spikes or thorns. But it's a fact that when certain kinds of insects start to feed on it, that triggers some kind of genetic program, and it will literally produce spikes to protect itself. Now, here's another fascinating thing. If you take a seed from one of these radishes that has not had its spike program activated, it doesn't have any spikes. But once the spike program is activated, you take the seed from that radish, and the radishes that grow from that seed will have the thorns. So you see, Genesis is not a myth. It's not a fairy tale. It was talking about junk DNA not being junk back from the very beginning. So everything that we see in the biosphere is perfectly harmonious with the sacred history of Genesis. And the last point that I'm going to make, which is so fundamental, is that all of the change that we see, and it can be pretty dramatic, like with those crested anoles I was talking about, it's all downhill. It's all devolutionary. Nothing new is ever being produced. The evolutionists tried to give examples of where something new came about through mutation and natural selection. But our chief biologist, Pamela Acker, has done a masterful job of analyzing every one of their claims that we're aware of. And she proves in every single case, no new functional biological information has actually been produced. Most of the so-called beneficial mutations, like sickle cell, that I remember being taught in high school biology was a beneficial mutation, they're actually examples of something being broken, which confers a short-term benefit on an organism. But in terms of the organism's overall fitness and survivability, it's always a negative. There's not one single example of new functional biological information coming into existence through a natural process.
It's fascinating. Excuse me. I'm just getting over a cold. So I know you don't have a whole lot of time left. Talk a little bit more about the work of the Colby Center, how people can come find you and support you. And we'll, of course, have links listed below.
Yes, I'm so grateful for this opportunity to come and talk to you again. It's been a while since our previous interview.
Well,
And
almost 10 years now.
yes, yes. So I would like to invite everyone to visit our website, www.kolbecenter.org, but also the website foundationsrestored.com, where you can watch the first 2 episodes of our DVD series, Foundations Restored, on the website for nothing. Now, this is the most comprehensive defense of the traditional Catholic doctrine of creation from the perspective of theology, philosophy, and natural science that has ever been produced in the video medium. And we have magnificent teachers like Father Chad Ripperger, Dr. Wolfgang Smith, Dr. John Sanford, and others featured in this DVD series. If you go to the website, you'll see the great recommendations from bishops, from theologians, scientists, people like the former editor of Homiletic and Pastoral Review, who praised this DVD series to the sky. We get testimonies from all over the world that make me literally cry, because people are coming back to the practice of the faith, or being totally rejuvenated in their faith and in their spiritual lives, because just from watching this DVD series, they see that the traditional doctrine of creation is true, and that restores their faith in the inerrancy of Scripture and in the infallibility of the Church in her authoritative teaching. And it also restores the person's sense of closeness to God, and their understanding that God, who is all good, all loving, and all wise, created for us this perfectly beautiful, complete, and harmonious universe, and that it's only sin that has brought the death and deformity and disease and misery into the world. And so we actually believe that if this information, if this knowledge were given to all Catholic young people, and of course they would also have to be taught the basics of the spiritual life, to frequent the sacraments, to practice mental prayer every day, to read the lives of the saints. But if they did these other things and they received this knowledge, we believe that we would put a stop to the mass exodus of young Catholics out of the Catholic Church, which is now completely out of control. And this is why I don't expect anyone in the audience to take my word for anything that I've said. That would be foolish. But I hope that you will make your own investigation using our resources and any other resources that you want to examine. But if you make your own investigation and you conclude that what the Kolbe Center is defending is the truth, please don't stay on the sidelines. Get into the fight and help us, because we need help in order to be able to reach all the young Catholics in the world. And that is our objective, to do that as quickly as possible.
All right. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule today. I appreciate it.
No, I'm very grateful, and I'm very grateful to you, Ryan, for all the work that you've done. And I'll just mention one of the many projects that Ryan has done that has been especially helpful to us, and that was his translation of St. Robert Bellarmine's Catechism, because we have been absolutely amazed to see how the only fully church-approved apparition of the Blessed Virgin Mary in the entire history of the United States actually took place 6 weeks before Darwin published Origin of Species. And that when that apparition took place, the Queen of Heaven appeared to an 18-year-old Belgian immigrant, Adele Breeze, and gave her a commission to teach the children their catechism, because there were literally thousands of Catholic immigrant children running around like savages with nobody to teach them the basic doctrines of the faith. Well, we discovered that just a few years before, the US bishops and synod had mandated the production of a catechism for all the Catholics in the United States, but it was to be based on the Catechism of St. Robert Bellarmine. Well, thanks to Ryan, it was easy for me to see what St. Robert Bellarmine taught about creation. And sure enough, he teaches exactly what is in the Catechism of Trent, that God created everything in 6 24-hour days by willing it into existence and consecrated the seventh day from the foundation of the world. So lo and behold, this is what the Baltimore Catechism teaches, that Adele Breeze, who became Sister Adele Breeze, became a religious sister, this is what she dedicated her life to teaching. And this is amazing, because we always ask our brothers and sisters to consider these 2 points. And this is a great way probably for me to finish what I have to say. Number 1, did the Queen of Heaven, when she came down to earth to give Adele Breeze this mandate, did she know how, when, and over what period of time God created the world? Of course she did. She had the beatific vision. She knew everything in God, but what she knew in God was the same thing that she had learned from St. Anne from the Sacred History of Genesis on her mother's knee when she was a little girl. Now, question number 2 is, would the Blessed Virgin Mary come down to earth and commission Adele Breeze to teach anything to her children that was not completely true? Of course not. It's unthinkable. But you see, if theistic evolution is true, or even progressive creation, the idea that God didn't use evolution, but periodically stepped in and created new kinds of creatures over billions of years, if either of those accounts is true, it would mean that God and the Blessed Virgin Mary allowed the Holy Catholic Church to teach a completely false account of the origins of man and the universe from the beginning, and then had to raise up godless men like Darwin and Ernst Haeckel and T.H. Huxley to enlighten our church leadership so that they could finally understand how God actually created the world. This is simply unthinkable. It's totally impossible. The character of God is not compatible with that scenario. So we have good reason to hold fast to what was handed down. And if you make your investigation and you come to the same conclusion that we've come to, please get into the fight. We would welcome your prayers and your support in carrying out this mission.
All right. And thank you for watching.
Ave